In previous videos, I have argued that the New Testament writings and writers are reliable, but there seems to be an issue remaining in that there are many discrepancies apparent when comparing the New Testament writings among themselves. Regardless of whether they're historical or not, how can they be reliable if it seems the Gospel writers told their stories with contradictory details and in different orders? In this video, I'm going to discuss these issues and more and show that while there seem to be discrepancies between the Gospels, we can show that there are good reasons to conclude that they harmonize. So I hope you'll stick around and find out why we think the Synoptic Gospels are harmonious and can be trusted. Welcome back, everyone. In this episode, we're talking about the Synoptic Problem. Not necessarily the Synoptic Problem as the Synoptic Problem, but we are going to be discussing mainly discrepancies among the Gospel accounts. Okay, I probably could have labeled this something different, but the Synoptic Problem is just so much easier to list than discrepancies among the gospel accounts or something like that. So I'll be talking about what the Synoptic Problem is in this episode, and I'll be talking mainly about, like I said, discrepancies among the gospels and why we don't think they are contradictory and how they can be harmonized. All of this we'll be talking about all this in light of the Synoptic Problem, so it is relevant. But you'll see what I'm talking about when we get there. As always, I like to start all these with a Bible passage, and we are switching to a new passage in this lecture and the next one. And this is something I've been excited about for months now, because this is one of my favorite verses in relation to apologetics. I mentioned in one of the last couple lectures that there is evidence in the New Testament that from day one, Christians have believed that Jesus was God and rose from the dead. And this passage is one of the best ways to argue for that. So let me go ahead and just tell you what the passage is and read it, and then we'll discuss it. So this passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. It's a very famous passage, but not a lot of people realize just how important this really is. But yes, this is Paul talking, and I'll go ahead and read it. He says, "For I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brothers and sisters at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me." Okay, so, really great passage. Already, we've talked about this passage before, whenever it talks about how Paul mentions that most of the people that Jesus appeared to are still alive. That was him challenging and emphasizing to his audience that, hey, there's still people alive right now who saw this. So if you don't believe me, you can go talk to them. So that's an interesting part of it. But what's really important about this is that you can see that pretty much almost all of, there's a lot more to Christian doctrine, obviously, but big portions of major Christianity, major Christian doctrines are all here. Christ died for our sins. He was buried. He was raised on the third day, and then he appeared to other people. So there's so much there that's showing what Christians throughout the centuries have believed about Jesus. Now, but the amazing thing about this passage and why I'm bringing it up to you, it's actually more relevant to our next lecture when I start talking about Jesus' resurrection. But to make this episode a little bit more even with that one, I was going to go ahead and talk about all this evidence here, and then you can just remember this when we start talking about the resurrection in the next couple episodes. But the amazing thing about this passage is that it shows evidence concluding or pointing to the fact that Christians, just a few years after Jesus died, already had a stylized, formalized way of talking about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, that's what I was going to show you on this next slide. So, if you are interested in this, I note my citations at the bottom there, because there's so much more to this than what I'm just going to cover in these couple slides. Gary Habermas, Michael Icona talk about this in their books. Gary Habermas, and I'm going to show these books at the end of this lecture, I believe. Gary Habermas has a book called The Historical Jesus. Michael Icona has a book called The Resurrection of Jesus, and you can find a discussion of this passage, just like I'm talking about it here, in those books. But there's evidence, first of all, notice that Paul says, I pass on to you as most important what I also received, okay? And he's saying he is just delivering something that he received himself. So we think that he didn't make this up when he was writing in the 50s. He got this from somebody else, okay? Now, more indicators besides him saying that this didn't come from him. There's actual internal textual evidence that he didn't make this up. When scholars look at this passage and they compare it with all of his other writings, there's many words in this creed, in this passage, that aren't words that Paul likes to use. In other words, when you see him in his other writings, whenever he could say a word for some of these, he would use a different word than what's listed in this passage. And there's a lot more than what I have listed here. These are just some of the more important ones, I thought. But for our sins, the way it's used in 1 Corinthians 15, that is found nowhere else in Paul throughout the New Testament. He never uses that formulation. According to the Scriptures, this is found nowhere else in Paul. Instead, he prefers to say, it is written. So he doesn't say according to the Scriptures. Usually in his letters, he says, it is written. He was, the 12. So this is an interesting thing. Nowhere else in his writings does he say the 12. Instead, he prefers to say the apostles. So those are just a few examples. There's other things in 1 Corinthians 15, like he was raised, third day he appeared. Those do show up in other places, but rarely do, and he usually likes to use different ones. But these three that I have listed are just a few examples. Okay, but they think that what he's saying in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 is a stylized early creed, a Christian creed. So whenever he starts in the second half of verse 3, going all the way to 7 and into 8, they think this is a creed. For one, it's organized in a stylized parallel form. Especially in verses 3-4, where it says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. The first and second lines are longer and end with according to the Scriptures, so they think that's possibly a stylized formulation of a creed. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, it contains Semitic indicators, words that are more Semitic, like the name Cephas, for example. This is the Aramaic form of Peter. It means rock. This passage in 1 Corinthians 15 also has indications of ancient Hebrew narration, with the triple usage of and that, and 2 references to the fulfillment of Scripture. So the point here in point 5 is that whenever ancient Hebrew, I've talked before about how the ancient Hebrew culture was big on oral traditions. Well, those are some of the things that they would put into a creed that was going to be to help it be more memorizable. So like I said, if you are interested in all the reasons why they think that this is a creed and it came from somebody else besides Paul, I recommend you check out The Historical Jesus or The Resurrection of Jesus. But why is all this important? The reason why all this is so important is because if you remember in the past lecture or two, I emphasized that negative higher critical scholars believe that Paul's writings are authentic, at least a few of them, one of those being 1 Corinthians, right? So the majority of critical scholars believe that this letter is a genuine letter, that it was actually written by the Apostle Paul. Because of that, and if you remember, I mentioned that Paul's letters are written, especially 1 Corinthians, this was written around AD 54. So this is just a little over 20 years after Jesus' death. So that is one of the reasons why it's so significant, because he wrote this letter in around 54 AD. We've already talked about in past episodes about it takes like over 2 generations for legends usually to creep in, but this is just 20 years after Jesus' death, and Paul is writing to a church, giving them a creed that was already formalized before he wrote this letter. Now, looking at other writings in Paul, we think that we can put all this together to show that this creed existed not just a few years after Jesus' death. And again, now, don't take me to be saying that something's true just because higher critical scholars say it is. I just mention that because it just shows how strong the evidence is. Even negative higher critical scholars believe that Corinthians and Galatians and letters like that are legitimately from Paul. He wrote those, and they're usually dated in the 50s. Now, in Galatians 1, we see, because we're asking ourselves, where did Paul get this creed? In Galatians 1, 18 through 19, Paul mentions, "Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I didn't see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." We're asking ourselves, where did he get this creed? Well, I think a liberal dating of Paul seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus is supposed to be like 3 to 5 years after Jesus was said to have been resurrected. So, if really from what we get in the New Testament, we think that there's either one of 2 times that Paul would have got the stylized version of the gospel message. It's either directly from Jesus, whenever he met him 3 to 5 years after he died and was risen, or it was about 3 years after that, like what Paul mentions here in Galatians. "Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem." So because he didn't go directly to Jerusalem, if you remember, he didn't go directly to Jerusalem after he met Jesus. He says here in Galatians that there was a 3-year period in between that and him meeting the rest of meeting some of the other apostles. So we think that from what Paul says, there's only 2 places he would have got this. Either when he met the apostles 8 or so years, 5 to 8 years after Jesus' death, or directly from Jesus 3 to 5 years after his death. So, as you can see, this is evidence. And this is evidence, even a test. Obviously, a negative critical scholar wouldn't be making the argument I'm making. But even negative critical scholars believe that Paul wrote this letter. And Paul is telling us and giving us evidence that they're not just a few years after Jesus died. There were already creeds talking about how, already formulated by the Christian church, talking about how Jesus rose from the dead, appeared to people, and died for our sins. So I just think that is so interesting and really neat. And just some more evidence to put in your toolkit when you're talking about evidence for why we think that Christians from day one have believed that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Okay. Now, for the rest of this time, I'm going to be talking about discrepancies, so-called discrepancies in the Gospels. Before I do, I wanted to read some questions for reflection like we always do. So I think I've got 3 of them for you. Our first one is, are you aware of the claim that there are contradictions within the Synoptic Gospels? 2 is, do you think it is bad that some of the Gospels seem to have different claims about the events? Why or why not? And 3, if the apostles or the early church fabricated the stories, do you think they would have left in or created these contradictions? That's a great one. We should, obviously be answering these throughout, but those are some things to be thinking about as we go along. So I mentioned, I titled this The Synoptic Problem, but there could have been a better label for this lecture, something like Discrepancies Among the Synoptic Gospels or something like that, but that would have been a lot longer. So anyways, I wanted to tell you really quickly why, what is the Synoptic Problem and why am I mentioning that in relation to talking about discrepancies in the Gospels. Whether maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't. A synopsis is a general summary of something, right? And synoptic would be forming a summary, doing something in a summarizing way. Okay, so that's why they call the Gospels a synoptic Gospels, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, anyways, because they were summarizing a portion of a larger narrative, right? Jesus was alive for 33 years, but the Synoptic Gospels provide a summary of what happened whenever he started his ministry, and obviously, when he died and when they claimed he rose from the dead. Okay, now what is the Synoptic Problem? I've got it listed here as the specific question of the literary relationship of the Synoptics, whether any of the Gospel writers knew one or more of the other Gospels and utilized that information as he wrote, right? So throughout the first 1,500 centuries of the church, to my knowledge, the Gospels were mainly thought to be reliable and to supplement each other. But along with the rise of negative historical criticism came many skeptical views of the Bible and the Synoptic Gospels, right? I think I talked about this earlier when we talked about the possibility of miracles. I said that doubts on the possibility of miracles and doubts about the reliability and inspiration of the Bible rose during the Enlightenment in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And out of all this critical study of the Bible, skepticism towards the supernatural and miracles and new approaches to studying literature came various objections against the harmony and origins of the Synoptic Gospels. So the Synoptic Problem is mainly the problem concerning the literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels, right? Like I just said. If you've ever looked at the differences and similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll notice that sometimes they're similar when discussing certain events, and sometimes they're different. Sometimes they're a lot different. Some omit whole sections of information that others contain. Now, these concerns, or noting this, led higher critical scholars to wonder if all or some of the gospel writers had access to previously written or oral material when composing their gospels, and which gospels were written first. They were trying to figure out, what was going on here. When Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their gospel, did they have some source they were looking at? Did they know of the other gospels? Which one was written first and all that? And I think it's around the 1950s, there was somewhat of a consensus had been reached that Mark's gospel was written first, and then Matthew and Luke's gospels were written later, using Mark as a source. And then some people think there's another source that doesn't exist anymore, known as Quell or Q, known as Q source. Okay, but that's what the Synoptic Problem is. And here's just, this is what I was talking about just now in this slide. I've got, if you're listening in a podcast, I just have a slide showing Mark at the top, Matthew beneath that, Luke beneath that, and Q in there. And it's just an illustration showing that where these scholars think Matthew and Luke came from, both Matthew and Luke, using Mark and some Q source. I personally, I like to go with the traditional accounts. Now there is internal and external evidence showing that the order and the dating of the Gospels is closer to what the church has always said. The tradition of the church has said the order they were written in and all that. I really enjoy this really short, good book called Why Four Gospels? The Historical Origins of the Gospels, written by David Allen Black. He argues for the traditional dates and order, and I just think they just make sense to me. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I've taught I teach a class on Introduction to World Religions at South Plains College, where I work. And when you study the history of all these world religions, it's not funny, but it's striking to me that you'll see that, after the Enlightenment, all this higher criticism. Higher criticism isn't just something that's aimed at the Bible. There's higher critical scholars in religion that have been at least Western scholars that have studied all world religions. And for example, I saw some scholars who don't believe that Buddha existed. I've seen, it's just interesting to me that just because, of course, as a Christian, I would say that Buddhism is false, right? There's got to be a problem there somewhere. I personally believe that Buddha existed. I just don't think the world is the way he said it is. For philosophical and other reasons. But my point is that there's scholars, higher critical scholars, who don't even think that Buddha existed. So I'm sympathetic towards traditions. It's hard for me to think that Buddhism would get started if Buddha didn't exist, right? There's some people that think that Muhammad didn't even exist. So, but anyways, for me, I like to take and I've mentioned this before, I like to take an innocent until guilty stance on things like this. And there's not only the ancient church fathers wrote about the order in which the Gospels were written, but also there's evidence in the Gospels themselves that kind of show why we think they're written in this order. But anyways, I don't have time to talk about all this. But in my slide here, I've got Matthew, and I've used this dating before, I think in the last couple lectures. In my slides, I've got Matthew listed as AD 42, Mark at AD 60, Luke at AD 62, and John at AD 96. And this order of the Gospels to me makes sense. It's not only the traditional ordering of it, but also, if you remember, the early church was supposed to go to the Jews first, the Gentiles second. Matthew is one of the most Jewish ones, and we'll talk about this later on, that tries to represent Jesus as the Messiah, right? So it would make sense to me that they would have this one written first because they're ministering to the Jews first. Mark is written by Mark, right? I've mentioned this before, that he was an associate of the Apostle Peter. We think that Mark, actually, his gospel was him recording a speech by Peter to Roman officials. And that would make sense to me because it's one of the shortest ones. If he's giving a quick speech, he can't include everything like Luke does. And we think maybe Luke is later because this is after Luke, the associate of the Apostle Luke, the associate of the Apostle Paul, did all of his investigating, and also the church didn't go to the Gentiles until later on. So it would make sense that they're in this order. But anyways, I didn't really need to say all that, but this will come up a little bit here and there. But anyways, I was talking about all of this. I didn't really need to go into all that detail, but some of this will come up later. And I just wanted to talk about the Synoptic Gospels, when we think they were written. This will help as we go along. But yes, this is the Synoptic Problem. The Synoptic Problem is the questioning of the literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels, who wrote what and when and where. But out of this study, this intense scrutiny of the Synoptic Gospels, it has been emphasized by many scholars that there are differences between the Gospels, okay? So one of the main reasons why I wanted to cover this issue today is because we just talked about the reliability of the manuscripts, the reliability of the writers, but maybe the seeming contradictions between gospel accounts might bring some of that into question. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to mention this just to cap it all off, just in case someone, whether you're a believer coming across this for the first time, or if you're a believer talking to people about this and they bring up these discrepancies, you'll at least know it exists. So, but there's three main reasons, and this is a huge study all in itself. But there's three main considerations when thinking about discrepancies between the Gospels, and I wanted to talk about these three. So there's the ancient practice of paraphrase. There's chronological problems among the synoptics, and there's variations in names and numbers, okay? So we're going to talk about all three of these, show you some examples from the New Testament, and show you how they might look, when you line the passages up, they might look contradictory, but they're not really, okay? I think one of the most surprising to people has to do with the ancient practice of paraphrasing. Okay, so critics of the Gospels have argued that the Gospels contradict each other because the synoptic authors sometimes seem to quote Jesus differently. But, like I mentioned, this is not surprising given our modern obsession with getting our facts straight and quoting people to the letter. In modern times, in these modern days, we're all about, especially, and I teach English composition. I'm so... when I'm teaching my students to write research papers, we're so adamant that if you take someone else's words, you have to use quotations. If you quote them word for word, you have to use quotations. But if you just paraphrase them, you don't have to. But you have to provide a source. We're so in these modern times, we're so, and it makes sense because of copyright laws and the Western emphasis on personal property and liberty and all that. But in these modern times, if you see quotation marks, that means that you're quoting this person word for word. Well, when you look at your English Bible, you're going to see quotation marks all throughout it, especially when Jesus is talking. But the thing is, what most lay Christians don't realize is that the ancient Hebrew actually didn't even have quotation marks. They didn't have quotation marks back then. Researchers have emphasized that ancient authors did not share our modern sentiments. Greek and Hebrew actually didn't even have quotation marks, and ancient authors supposedly did not normally try to capture the exact words of the figures they reported on. Basically, as long as the authors were passing along the general meaning of the words they were recording, then they were thought to be reliable. In ancient times, it was mainly everything was done by paraphrasing. Sometimes you might quote someone word for word, sometimes you might not, but they didn't have quotation marks, and it was acceptable to their standards to just at least capture the spirit of what the person said. Okay, and if you get into the study of the synoptics, you'll see these fancy words here. Scholars distinguish between Jesus' actual words and Jesus' actual voice. So if you have ever heard of ipsissima verba or ipsissima vox, this is a distinction that scholars make when looking at the synoptics because they know the ancient practice of paraphrase. And, just to give you an example, I think we actually already looked at examples before. If you remember when we were talking about Jesus' self-understanding, in one gospel, Jesus would be quoted, or not quoted, right? But he would be paraphrased as saying, who do they say that I am? And in the other gospel, he says, who do they say that the Son of Man is? According to ancient standards, that both of those are fine. Probably Jesus, word for word, said the Son of Man, but in the other account, Jesus says, Jesus is reported to say, who do they say that I am? And that's some of the evidence telling us that he called himself the Son of Man. But here's another example. So in Mark chapter 1, verse 11, it says, and a voice came from heaven, you are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, it says, and a voice from heaven said, This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. So a big difference here is in Mark 1, it says, you are my beloved Son. In Matthew 3, it says, this is my beloved Son. Scholars believe, and I'm about to show you a slide showing that all the different big themes of each gospel, each synoptic gospel. Scholars believe that sometimes to explain why one synoptic author wrote differently from the other is because of their audience. And this is definitely something that's definitely going along with a concept that I teach in my composition class all the time. Knowing your audience is going to determine what you're going to say in your speech or what you're going to say in your essay. And so, for example, here in Mark 1 and Matthew 3, some scholars have argued that maybe Mark, in giving his speech to some Roman officials, wanted them to realize that everybody in the crowd could hear God. It wasn't just all in Jesus' head. So instead of it being like in Matthew 3, this is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased, they think that maybe that explains it. In Mark 1, he's saying, you are my beloved Son. A voice came from heaven. So anyways, but you can see in both of these cases, it's basically saying the same thing, and that's okay according to ancient standards. Let's look at another example. In Luke 13, Luke chapter 13, verse 19, it says, it's like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds of the sky nested in its branches. In Matthew 13, verse 31, it says, he presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. So in the first one, in Luke, we've got a man sowing a mustard seed in his garden. In Matthew 13, it says that a man took and sowed a mustard seed in his field. This is one of my favorites as far as this point. So as I've said before, Matthew is a very Jewish gospel that was meant to be for the Jewish people, and it's trying to present Jesus as the Messiah. Scholars believe that to explain this discrepancy, so apparently the Jewish purity laws forbade people to the Jewish people to plant mustard seeds in their garden. But the Gentile people did plant mustard seeds in their garden. So Matthew definitely wouldn't be quoting Jesus as saying that someone, the kingdom of God is like someone planting a mustard seed in their garden. But when Luke is preaching and talking to Gentiles, that planting a mustard seed in your garden is going to make more sense to them and be more relatable. So this is just another example of where they think that the audience determines them saying it in different ways. I think I've got one more example for us, and then I'll move on to the next point. So here's another example of paraphrasing. In Luke chapter 22, verse 70, it says, they all asked, are you then the Son of God? And he said to them, you say that I am. In Matthew 27, verses 63 through 64, it says, but Jesus kept silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said it, Jesus told him. So, in the first one, in Luke 22, it says, are you then the Son of God? Jesus says, you say that I am. In Matthew 27, they say, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said it, replied Jesus. And, you can see again here, note that Matthew mentions that the high priest asked if he was specifically the Messiah. Matthew's audience is a Jewish audience, that he's trying to present Jesus as the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament that the Jewish people were so familiar with. So, of course, he mentions that. In Luke, Luke left that out. He kept in the Son of God. But his audience might have not been as concerned with whether Jesus was the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament, because a Gentile audience isn't going to be as familiar with the Old Testament as the Jewish people were. So you see here in all three of these examples, these verses basically say the same thing. They just might have been changed a little bit because of who their audience was. But the spirit of each, the meaning is still in both of them. It's just not exact. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's how the ancient peoples did things. If you're interested in differences between the synoptics, just know that there is a lot of literature on this. One book I recommend is by Stephen Cox and Kendall Easley. It's called Harmony of the Gospels. And what they do is they show they'll list the Gospels they'll line them all up so that you can see parallel passages right next to each other. And and what I think is really neat about this specific book is that they also comment on why they think some of them are different. So if you're interested in that, there's all sorts of Harmony of the Gospels available. A lot of people have tried to harmonize them and see if they can line up the stories and everything. And there's a lot of these. But I recommend this, Harmony of the Gospels by Cox and Easley. So that's one, paraphrasing. Just know that ancient peoples paraphrased. They didn't have quotes. So, the modern reader is going to look at one gospel and it's going to be in quotes and think that if this quote doesn't match up directly with this quote, then there's a problem. But for one, they put in those quotations just to show you that this is, the author was saying this is the words of someone else. But there weren't quotes back then. So there's nothing wrong with that. Another issue that you might have already noticed if you're a believer is that the Gospels sometimes have certain events out of order when you look at them together. For example, Luke tells of John the Baptist's imprisonment at the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry. I think it's in Luke 3. But Mark's gospel mentions John the Baptist's imprisonment in the middle of Jesus' Galilean ministry around Mark 6. So I'm not saying that the gospels tell stories, a specific story in different order. And sometimes between the gospels, it has major events happening in different orders like that. So not the events themselves, what happened in the event, but the events will be presented in different orders. But it's been emphasized for centuries by Bible scholars that the four Gospels did not only have different audiences, but they also emphasize different aspects of Jesus' ministry. I'm going to come back to this slide, but I wanted to say really quickly, if you didn't already know, each gospel actually presents Jesus in a different way, and it makes sense after, and I mentioned this a second ago when we were looking at the order and the dates of the gospels. Each gospel author was presenting Jesus in a different way. Matthew presents Jesus as the promised Messiah and the coming King. Mark, of course, Mark maybe just wrote down and possibly edited a little bit Peter's speech, but Peter's speech was supposedly to a Roman officials, so it makes sense to me that Peter would present Jesus as the suffering servant, and that's kind of a theme throughout the book of Mark. In the book of Luke, Jesus is mainly presented as the Son of God and the Son of David, and in John, Jesus is presented as the Son of God, and his divinity is emphasized. But we think that these major themes of the Gospels kind of provide a clue as to why certain events are given in different orders. And scholars believe that they're given in different orders because of the theme of each one. One thing that's important to know is that there are different Greek words that get translated into the English chronological transition words now and then. So if you see in your Bible, it'll say, now this happened, or then this happened. But the thing with that is that in the Greek, sometimes these Greek words can simply just mean and. So it's not like the gospel authors are saying this happened and then this happened right after that happened. No, they're just kind of presenting events, not necessarily saying in which chronological order they happen. And we think that a lot of times in the Gospels, they're presented in thematic order, not necessarily chronological order. I think Luke's Gospel is supposed to be mainly in chronological order, but like I said, that is a whole study in itself, so it's something that you have to look at. But yeah, let me show you some examples of this, and I've already mentioned this one. In Luke 3, Luke tells of John the Baptist's imprisonment at the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry. In Mark 6, Mark's Gospel mentions it in the middle of Jesus' Galilean ministry. Another example is in Luke 5. Luke 5, verses 1 through 11, describes the call of Peter, John, and James later in the narrative, and also joins it with the story of the miraculous catch of fish. In Mark's Gospel, it places the call early on in Mark 1, 16 through 20. But they think this is different from Mark's Gospel, because Luke wanted to show that the disciples didn't just pick up and leave to follow Jesus for no reason. So maybe whenever Peter was giving his speech, he's just matter-of-factly saying these things. But since Luke is writing to a Gentile audience, he wanted to make sure that they realized that these disciples didn't just pick up everything they did and follow Jesus for no reason. There was a good reason why they were following him. So that's maybe a reason why they're like that. But the biggest consideration is to know that oftentimes the gospel writers were presenting events in thematic order, not necessarily chronological order, okay? And the last major topic I wanted to talk about in this lecture is sometimes there's variations in names within stories, and there's variations within numbers of people or other things in stories, okay? And your critics are going to want to say, oh, look, they're contradicting each other, so they're wrong. But I just wanted to show you these, because in each case, you'll see that just because one says something different from the other, it doesn't entail a necessary contradiction. Okay? If you just look at it and think a little bit longer, take an innocent until proven guilty approach, you'll see that if you think about it, they're really not contradicting each other. Okay? I can give you, let's see, I was going to give like 4 examples. So one example is in Mark 1, verse 39. It says, he went into all of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. In Luke 4, verse 44, it says, and he was preaching in the synagogues of Judea. Okay, so your hardcore critic here might want to say, oh, look, there's a discrepancy. Mark is saying that he went into Galilee, and Luke is saying that he was in Judea. So there's a contradiction here. It's actually believed that Jesus probably just went to Galilee, but here's the thing. Luke was simply mentioning that took place in Judea, which includes Galilee, right? So it's possible that this detail was more important to Peter than it was to the Gentile Luke, who's writing to a Gentile audience, right? We think that maybe Peter, it was important for Peter to have this specific detail in there, while Luke is just matter-of-factly stating it took place in Judea. You know, if you check a map, you'll see that that's not a contradiction. One is just more detailed than the other. And the rest of these examples are similar to that. So this next one is an example using Mark 10, verse 46, and Matthew 20, verse 30. In Mark 10, verse 46, it says, they came to Jericho, and he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd. Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the road. In Matthew 20, verse 30, it says, there were 2 blind men sitting by the road. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. So in Mark 10, it's saying that a blind beggar was there, just one. In Matthew 20, it's saying that there were 2 blind men. Now, while this might look contradictory on the surface, and this is really this honestly is driving home a point that we made in an earlier lecture. In Mark, we have an emphasis on Bartimaeus. It was specifically said his name and who he was. In Matthew, we see there's more than one, but the names of them aren't mentioned. But does that, note here that neither one of these gospel authors said there was only one blind person, or there were two, and that's the main thing, is that Mark doesn't say there was only one. And Matthew 20 doesn't mention what their names were. So Peter is focusing in on this one person. Everything that Peter says in Mark 10:46 can be true, even if there's two blind men sitting there, right? He is emphasizing this one person, and this is exactly what you would expect if you have multiple independent eyewitness sources. One person noticed this one thing more than the other person did. Okay, so Peter and Matthew are going to tell things differently from the way they saw it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the big thing to remember is that Mark did not say there was only one person there. He just mentioned one person. A similar thing is found in Mark 5 and Matthew 8. So Mark 5 verse 2 says, "As soon as he got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him." In Matthew 8 verse 28, it says, "When he had come to the other side, to the region of the Gadarenes, two demon-possessed men met him as they came out of the tombs. They were so violent that no one could pass that way." Again, Mark just mentions one person. Matthew mentions two, but Mark didn't say there was only one person. In Mark 16 verse 5, it says, "When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. They were alarmed." In Luke 24 verse 4, it says, "While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men stood by them in dazzling clothes." And again, Mark could be emphasizing this one person, while Luke could be mentioning that there were two, but Mark doesn't say there was only one. It seems like Peter focuses in on one thing. It seems like in all these stories, he's focusing on this one individual and kind of ignoring other people, or just remembering these specific details about this one person that he was looking at. But I wanted to show you this because while these might look contradictory on the surface, like I've said, they're not showing a necessary contradiction. If you're taking a innocent until proven guilty approach and being more charitable, you can see that these aren't contradicting each other. In fact, something that I'm going to go into here in a couple lectures, we think there's a word for what's happening here, and this is all evidence, not that the gospel writers were getting the stories wrong. It's all evidence pointing to the fact that they were eyewitnesses to these events. We call this an undesigned coincidence. Now, with those ones that I've just showed you, it's more it's not really, one story doesn't really give insight into the next. Now, that one story where it's giving Bartimaeus' name and things like that, that is kind of giving insight into the other one, even though he's only mentioning one person, the other one mentions two. But there's other passages in the New Testament where one passage will give more information to another, and one passage will answer a question that you had from the other one. And if you just had one passage in isolation, you would have been puzzled. Okay, we call this an undesigned coincidence, and this has been known by Bible scholars for centuries. They've been writing about this since the 1700s and 1800s. Take, for example, Matthew 26, verses 67 through 68, and Luke 22, 63 through 65. Matthew 26 and 67 says, "Then they spat in his face and beat him. Others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you?'" Now, imagine that you're reading Matthew 26 in isolation, and you didn't have anything else. And you're reading the story about the Jewish officials slapping Jesus in the face, and then asking him, "Prophesy to us and tell us who hit you." You'd probably be thinking, that's a strange thing to say to someone that you just slapped in the face. Of course, like, why would he need to prophesy? Why would God need to tell him who slapped him in the face? He just got slapped in the face. You can't do that from a distance, right? Now, in Luke 22, though, you read Luke 22, verse 63 says, "The men who were holding Jesus started mocking and beating him. After blindfolding him, they kept asking, 'Prophesy, who was it that hit you?' And they were saying many other blasphemous things to him." If all we had was Matthew 26, we wouldn't realize exactly what's going on in the story. Luke 22, this different account of the same event gives us more information as to why the things were happening in Matthew the way they were. Jesus was blindfolded, so that's why they were telling him to prophesy who it was that was slapping him in the face. He wouldn't have seen it because he had a blindfold on. And these are what we call undesigned coincidences. If you remember, I've mentioned J. Warner Wallace before. He wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. He was a cold case detective in Los Angeles for years. And if you read his story, it's really interesting because he didn't believe in Christianity, but all of the principles he was taught as a cold case detective pointed to everything that he saw in the New Testament being a true eyewitness accounts from multiple independent sources. So in cases like these, and cases like we just saw with the different names and numbers, some people taking the guilty until proven innocent approach are going to be saying, "Oh, see, there you go. It's all contradictory." But if you notice, if you just give it a chance, you look into it a little bit deeper, you take that innocent until proven guilty approach, you'll see that there's an explanation for all of these, and there's things that we wouldn't even known about if we hadn't have considered it further and just wrote these off as being incorrect. So that's what I was talking about today. These issues that have arisen through this high scrutiny of the Gospels because of the Synoptic problem. If you are interested in discrepancies in Bible passage altogether, especially in the Gospels, I recommend these two books: The Big Book of Bible Difficulties by Norm Geisler and Thomas Howe, and the Big Book of Bible Difficulties is amazing. Dr. Geisler, the late Dr. Geisler, and Dr. Thomas Howe, I don't even know. I mean, I don't know how they did all the research for this, but just about any problem passage in the Bible, they have an entry for it, and they explain how it's not contradictory. They explain why it says what it does. That is an amazing book if you haven't already seen it. If you're specifically interested in issues with the gospel accounts themselves, I recommend the Historical Reliability of the Gospels by Craig Blomberg. But yeah, that's our lecture for today. Whether it's differences in names or numbers or differences in what it says, because between two quoted passages, I just wanted y'all to know that these can harmonize and they don't seem to be problematic the more you look into it. Here's our questions for reflection again, so hopefully you got the answers to these. As always, if you want to put answers to these or discuss other things in the comment section, please do. Or send me an email if you're listening. Go to my website, click on the links in the podcast description, and let me know what you think about these questions for reflection or any other comments. So here's the questions for reflection again. Are you aware of the claim that there are contradictions within the Synoptic Gospels? 2, do you think it is bad that some of the Gospels seem to have different claims about the events? Why or why not? And 3, if the apostles or the early church fabricated the stories, do you think they would have left in or created these supposed contradictions? I've got I think this is one of our last times we'll spend on our Charles Colson quote. Charles Colson says, "The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is more powerful than anything else we believe. By his resurrection, Jesus proved he is who he says he is. Be confident in this truth. Stand on the holy word of God. Don't sell the world a false bill of goods. Preach the word, defend the faith, live the faith." Just wanted to Again, as I do at the end of all these, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Southern Evangelical Seminary. It's where I was educated with a PhD in philosophy of religion. If you are interested in these apologetic topics and want to dive deeper, whether it's theology, philosophy, apologetics, Southern Evangelical Seminary is a great place. They have in-person classes, online classes, and you can get things all the way from just a certificate in biblical languages or certificate in apologetics to a undergraduate degree, to a master degree in apologetics or philosophy, MDivs with emphasis on apologetics or other, just regular things, other pastoral things, doctor of ministry, PhD, you name it, they've got it. I highly recommend Southern Evangelical Seminary, and I also recommend Kingdom Preparatory Academy, which is a classical Christian school in Lubbock, Texas. This is Lubbock, Texas, where I live. My kids go there. It's a great classical Christian school. They have grades all the way from pre-K to 12th grade, and it's a great school that teaches everything from a classical Christian perspective, and I think it's a great alternative to public education here in the Lubbock area. So if you go to kingdomprep.org, you can get more information, or you can drop by, or just Google it and drop by and give them a call or give them a visit. They're great people, and I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to the next lecture. We're going to be talking about 3 different arguments for Jesus' resurrection, just giving a quick survey before we before I spend an entire lecture presenting one argument for Jesus' resurrection. So I hope to see you there, and I hope you have a great day.